What's up, guys? Alex Louis here, back for you with your Angular course. And what we're gonna do today is something very exciting. We're gonna try and fetch some data from API. And what I want to go over is first how we're gonna do this in terms of building the architecture, simple architecture, and then we'll actually look at the Angular code. So simple example with Observable using the HTTP client. Now, as you know, in Angular, the HTTP client, when you want to do a GET or a POST or any type of HTTP request, the HTTP client will always return back an observable. Now, before I get into how we're going to do this and how I'm going to explain observables, let's look at just our architecture first, and then we can go through the whole code. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to create a data object, which is going to bind to whatever we're getting back from the API. Then we're going to create a data service, which will in turn be used by our component, which we're going to build in step 3, to actually fetch the data and have a function that is some function such as get jobs or get data. In this particular case, we have an API that returns a list of jobs for a particular search query. A data service would be an injectable class using dependency injection, and that will be allowed to be injected at any particular component. Right now we're going to do it for the component we're going to build. And then lastly, we're going to build a component that uses a data service, which will return back an observable, and we'll use this observable, subscribe to it, and then map that response to the data object that we build in step 1, and then render it on the UI. So let's actually look at how it looks in terms of visually. So we have the left side, you'll see, is what we've been doing. We create a component in the interface, so you can think of this as an HTML file, and this is a TypeScript file, which is the component file. And then we're actually going to now separate logic a bit, where we're going to create a data service class, which in turn will use an observable. It'll use the HTTP client from Angular, and then obviously it's going to make use of the observable interface from our XJS. And then this service will call the API that I'm going to show you in a minute, which will return back the data. And then it's going to return back the data to my data service, and then the component will be able to get the observable, subscribe to it, and once it does a subscription, then it will return back the data, and we'll see it. Now, my design skills aren't the best, so I will warn you that it's going to look kind of crappy, but I think it'll help you get the idea of what we want to do. Okay, so here we have Postman, which we're using, and we are actually going to call this particular endpoint API, which in turn will be able to get the data. It's a get call. So if I call this, and I'm going to call it with my description called Angular, and then the location, which is New York. So I get a list back of JSON data, which has a couple of properties, JSON properties with its values. So we actually want to get this data from this API and then render it on the front end. Now, as I mentioned before, the first thing we want to do is we want to create a data object. And this is what we're doing here. In this simple example, what we're going to do is we're going to take this object, and when we get the data back, we're actually going to map it to the JSON that's being returned. Now, I made this an interface because in programming, an interface is a contract that says you must have these particular properties, or else the contract doesn't it's not valid. Now, you could have made this a class as well, and there's a lot of conflicting information on the internet versus, well, if you have a data object, what would you use, a class or an interface? In my opinion, I think when you're just trying to map data, you should use an interface. Now, if you're trying to utilize some type of inheritance, and you're going to reuse the object and make it be a type of inheritance chain, then you'd probably be better off using a class. And then if you're going to do some custom logic within your object class, then you'd probably construct some functions within your class and and build it as a class. The interface, I'm just saying this is a simple object. I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm not going to do any type of logic with any properties here. So I will make it an interface, a plain old interface, and that's what it is. Now, when we create the interface, you notice that the property names must match whatever I am using, well, whatever the API is using here. So ID type. So this will allow us, because we're using an interface, this is a contract that says if the API is returning these properties, then they must match my interface properties as well. And that will allow us to actually bind the JSON to this interface. So that was step one of what we talked about in my PowerPoint presentation. Step two is we want to create a data service. In the data service, we create a class, which is an injectable. We use an injectable attribute here, and there's two things we're going to utilize here. We're going to use the injectable interface and then the HTTP client class. And the HTTP client class comes from Angular library, and we're going to use that and inject it through a constructor and use it to return back an observable. So if you notice, I have a base URL with my endpoint URL here, and this is what I'm calling over here. This will be my URL. Now, again, this is a simple example, so I'm not going to play with the parameters or anything, because I don't want to take this, go into too much detail and confuse you in terms of how to pass in parameters and then the URL. What should you? We're just trying to fetch data. That's all we're trying to do. So we make this an injectable. This is an injectable directive, which tells us that this does not need any type of HTML. This is an actual service class, and I'll show you what we need to do at the app module level. But here we have a property for a URL API. We inject the HTTP client through a constructor, and now it's accessible within our functions. So I wrote a function called getJobs, which in turn is going to return an observable, and I'm going to use the HTTP client's .get function. So this is a get. He's doing an HTTP get on this URL. So this is going to return back an observable, whoever calls this particular function. So we did that. Now, the last thing we want to do, and then I'll show you what we need to do at the module level, at the module, is we want to create our jobs component. So our jobs component consists of me importing the component. And then this is a new import that we're going to use, and eventually you're going to use it a lot, is the observable class, which comes from the RxJS library. And this allows us to get back an observable type and then subscribe to that observable so we can actually pull the data from the API. This is our data service, which we're using to call our getJobs, right? So if we look back, our data service is a data service class. So we need to include that so that we may use its functions called getJobs. Remember back in my diagram, that's what we're going to do. From the component, we want to go to the data service. And then in turn, we're also going to use the job model, which is our interface that we're going to bind to the data that comes back. So this is something you've done before, which is a component. You've defined your component selector, and you're going to define your jobs component class. We're also going to define a property, a private property called jobs, which is of type job, which is our interface object. And we're going to actually build an array, because this has multiple results. For each job we're going to do, we're just going to create a job object. That's easy enough. So that would be an array for us. Now inside the constructor, and this is not best practice. The best practice would be to do it on an init function. When you have a when you have a component lifecycle, you have an init function, but we'll talk about that in the later lectures. So you won't see it loaded in a constructor, but in this constructor, I'm passing in my data service, which is injected. And now, when I have my data service, which is of type data service, this is my variable name. You could have named it anything you wanted. So I could have named it dService, ds, but the type has to be data service because that's the data service we're calling. That's where we build our get jobs function. Now, when we say this.dataService.getJobs, this in turn is going to return back an observable. This is going to return back an observable, and at the same time, we could have done this two ways. I could have created an observable and assigned it to whatever this call is. That won't do anything. That'll just get back an instance of an observable. The only time that it's actually going to go out and actually get the data is when we subscribe to this observable. So what I've done is inline just call it directly from my get jobs call. So I said dot subscribe, and now we are declaring a res to be the array, to map the arrays to job of the result. Okay, and then this result now will become an array of jobs that we have here. You remember, you still have an asynchronous function call here when you do a subscribe. So within here, you have an inline function. You have a callback function really that says, okay, when you get this back, then that's when you're going to take whatever you got back, which is of type job, okay, which is, remember, it's an interface, so it's our contract, and we're going to now assign it to our this.jobs, which is also a job array. Okay, so it's really clean. It's really clean when we do it this way. And then once we get it back, then we can look at the jobs HTML and use another directive which we call the ng4. So what I'm doing is I'm just getting the data here. Once I assign it on my constructor, then at the ng4 at the interface level, I can say that this is, let me just change this. This is my company, right? So this is just text I'm writing out. And then this is actually going to loop. So for each job of jobs, the jobs is actually going to be, jobs is actually binded from our component, right? Which is this jobs variable. For each job of jobs, let job of jobs. Then as you loop through each li, you want to render the property. So for this particular instance of job, the first job, you're going to render the company, the title, and the location. Next one, you're going to, again, render the company, job title, and the location. So now if I go back to my result, is I can now do this. Actually, let me save it. Sorry, this isn't saved. So let me actually save this. Save all. Okay. And once I save all, so there's company, Quartz, backend engineer, New York. So if we go back to our API, you have company Quartz, title, backend engineer, and location is New York. Now, if I actually change the service in the API, I want to maybe do Python, right? If I do Python, now my data service is going to change, obviously. And go back to our, let's see, so Python has a lot more results here. You have a company looking for a backend engineer in New York. These guys are looking for a backend engineer, full stack in New York, and so on. So very, very simple process to get the data. As we go through the weeks, we are going to use best practice. Okay, best practice. And one thing that I will tell you is that we should not do this. We should actually load the data using the ng init, and we'll find out what that actually is. Now the last thing I want to show you is, now that we have our classes, that really didn't work. It's not going to work unless you actually edit app module. So here are a couple things, right? So the first thing I had to do is, one, we need the HTTP client module from Angular Common HTTP. We also need the data service which I created, right? This is mine. This is a service, okay? And then we're also going to need the jobs component which we created as well, okay? Which which is part of the, if we look at the PowerPoint again, the service is this, right? We have the component over here on the left, okay? So with the interface, right? And then we have the data service. And the one thing that you don't see is the actual object, the interface, the jobs interface, which is the object, data object. We don't have to include it here because you're not, it's not part of a declaration that we're going to use or any type of module. So the objects themselves, you would just import or include them within whatever component or service you're going to use them in. So in this particular case, if we look at the jobs component, that's right now that's the only one we're using. So if I had another component, I can also import this from jobs obj, and that's all I would have to do. At the op module level, I wouldn't do that. I would just import it at the component level. I wouldn't have it available. Now, so we have jobs component, data service, HTTP client. We also have forms module as well. And within our arrays of what we need, remember declarations array, as we talked about in the last video, is these guys are all friends, so they want to know each other. So we introduce the jobs component to everybody else. So he's like saying, hey everybody, how's it going? Nice to meet you, nice to meet you. So they all know each other, right? Then we are also introducing an imports module, which is the forms, and we did that on the last video, and now we're introducing a new module for everybody to be able to access, which is the HTTP client module. Okay, so this module will be able to be used and be injected into either our components or our sole data service. So that brings me to the next array, which is the providers array. So providers array will include all your services, which will be able to be injected into your components or even be used by imports as well. And this sole data service which we created comes from our data service that is imported here, which we defined, and that's actually going out and making the API call. Now if I had more services, then I could include them here. Now the beauty about this is again, they're only going to get one instance, so it's a singleton, so it lives in memory. Once the app loads, the data service will be loaded, and so you can think of this as a root, and in this root everything's being built, and our data service provider is only being built once, and then when a component needs it, it'll be injected within each component with that one instance. So we don't have to have, if we have like, let's say we have 20 components, you're not going to have 20 separate data services being instantiated with its 20 different variables. Okay, you don't want that. You don't want to have a lot of memory, because remember, you're running this on the browser. You're not running this on the server. Okay, so this data service can be injected into any of these components or in the modules as well. And the component itself will use the data service, as we talked about here, to fetch the data, and it's going to get returned. Remember, it's going to return back an observable, because we remember that the HTTP client, any type of get or put call or post call, it's always going to return back an observable, and then you would have a callback function within that observable once you subscribe to it, and then do the mapping that you need to do at the data level. So if we look one more time back at the data service, I'm sorry, at the component level. Sorry about that. Not at the data. So the data service is just returning back the observable. But at the component level is where you actually want to do that pull. And then once we subscribe to it, remember this is an observable, we subscribe to it, we have a callback function here, and then we're able to map the results that we specified over here to jobs. Okay, So let's go back to the app module. Okay, so that's basically it in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed this first video on just trying to do an HTTP client request. What I'm going to do is I'm going to package this up and I'm going to put it on GitHub, and you can download it off the description in this video. Okay, so you can have fun with it, you can play with it, and hopefully you'll learn how to do something real quick. So, but again, it's not best practice, so this is not the best code that I can recommend, production code, not really, but it'll get you into a starting point. Okay, so don't forget to subscribe to my channel. If you enjoyed the video, give me a like. If you didn't, you can also send out an email, send out a comment, and then I'll see you in the next video. Take care.